Is everything okay? How did you die? It's been so long since anyone said my name like that. Like they meant it. Like it was mine to keep.
Welcome back to Nightfall Studio. This is episode 2 of Apartment 404. If you haven't watched episode 1 yet, click the link below to catch up first. Trust me, you'll want the full picture before this one, because everything is about to get a lot more emotional. Alright, let's pick up right where we left off. The morning after the old woman told me he was still waiting, I couldn't concentrate on anything else. Lectures blurred past me. I kept a small notebook for architecture sketches, and by the end of the day it was filled instead with questions I had no one to ask. I decided to do what I always do when something doesn't make sense. I went looking for records. The university library had a small local history section, mostly forgotten, mostly dust. I spent 2 hours there after class, scrolling through microfiche newspaper archives from decades back, searching for anything connected to the building's address. Most of it was nothing: old property notices, a fire 2 streets over in the 1980s, nothing that matched. Then I found it. A short article, barely 4 inches of column space, easy to miss if I hadn't been looking so hard. University student found deceased in Riverside apartment. The date was old enough that the photo hadn't scanned well, grainy, faded, but unmistakably him. Young. Beautiful in that same haunting way. The article was frustratingly brief: a student, 20 years old, found in his apartment after neighbors reported no activity for several days. No cause of death listed. No mention of foul play. Just a name. Peach. I sat there in that library, staring at a decades-old photograph of the boy who'd been lying beside me every night since I moved in, and felt something settle in my chest that was somewhere between grief and recognition, like meeting someone I already knew, without remembering how. That evening, I didn't wait for midnight. I searched the apartment itself, properly this time, the way I should have from the very first day. The drawer in the old wardrobe, the one that stuck, swollen with humidity, finally gave way when I pulled hard enough. Inside, a small stack of letters, tied with string gone brittle and pale. A photograph, corners soft with handling, of a young man who could only be Peach, laughing at something outside the frame, sunlight in his hair. And beneath the letters, a simple silver ring, tarnished dark with age, too small to have ever fit an adult hand comfortably, a promise ring, maybe, or something given far too young to mean what it clearly had meant. I didn't read the letters that night. Something about doing it while he might have been watching felt like a violation I wasn't ready to commit. I set them carefully back where I'd found them, and I waited. Midnight came, as it always did. He appeared, as he always did. But something was different that night. When I met his eyes, I said his name for the first time. Peach. He went completely still, stiller than his usual stillness, if that was possible. And for the first time since that first night, I saw something move across his face that wasn't grief. It was recognition. It was fear. It was hope, all tangled together in the same expression, like he couldn't decide which one to let win.
Like they meant it.
I didn't know what to say to that. What do you say to someone who's just told you that hearing their own name spoken with meaning is a rare thing, rare enough to bring them to tears? Something shifted in his face after he said it, like saying his name out loud had cracked open a door he'd kept sealed for a very long time. His eyes went distant, somewhere far past me, past the room, past the moonlight through the curtains. I didn't understand it then, but I understand it now. He wasn't looking at anything in that apartment anymore. He was looking backward, into a life he'd almost stopped letting himself remember. I didn't press him. I just stayed still and let him have that silence for as long as he needed it. His lips kept moving after that, shaping something else, something harder. I leaned closer. "What are you trying to say?" I whispered. It took him 3 tries. When his voice finally came again, it was barely audible, dry, cracked, like something unused for decades finding its way back into the world. Home. Just that one word. But it broke something open in both of us at once. I felt tears on my own face before I even realized I was crying, and across from me, Peach wept without hiding it for the first time, not the single silent tear from before, but real, shaking grief, decades of it, finally given permission to surface. Before we go any further, if you're enjoying Apartment 404 so far, hit subscribe and turn on notifications too, so you don't miss the next part here on Nightfall Studio. There's a lot more to Kim and Peach's story still ahead. Okay, back to the story. I didn't know what to do with a word like that. Home. It hung in the air between us, too small for everything it seemed to be carrying. I sat up slowly, moved closer instead of pulling away, and for the first time, I reached out and took his hand. I expected cold. I got it, but underneath the cold, something else. A kind of trembling, like he wasn't used to being touched gently anymore. Talk to me, I whispered. Please. Whatever this is, I want to understand it. He told me, slowly, that he didn't know how long he'd been here. That time didn't move right when you were waiting for someone. That he kept thinking if he stayed still enough, quiet enough, the person he was waiting for would finally walk through that door. But it's never him, he whispered. And then, quieter still, eyes lifting to mine, until you. My chest ached hearing that, a grief so old it had worn a groove into him, the way water wears down stone. I'm not him, I said gently. I don't even know who he was. He shook his head slowly, more tears sliding down his face, but he didn't pull his hand away from mine. I know, he whispered. I know you're not him. But you feel like him. Enough that it hurts. He asked me, so quietly I almost missed it, whether I would leave once he told me everything. Everyone always leaves, eventually, he said. I tightened my hand around his, cold fingers, trembling, holding on like it was the only warmth he'd felt in years. I'm not going anywhere, I told him. I said that already. I meant it then. I mean it now. For a long moment, he just looked at me, searching my face the way you search for a familiar landmark in a place you got lost in a long time ago. Then, slowly, he nodded. And for the first time since I'd met him, Peach began to tell me his story. He didn't speak again right away. For a long moment, we just sat there, his cold hand in mine, the lamp flickering faintly like even the electricity in that apartment was holding its breath along with us. Then, slowly, like someone stepping into water they weren't sure was safe, Peach began to talk. He told me his name was Peach, and that he'd been born not far from here, a district that doesn't exist anymore, torn down and rebuilt over decades ago. This building, he said, was the only piece of it left standing. He used to think that was unlucky. Now, he told me, he thought it might have been the only mercy he ever got. He'd been 20. Studying literature at the university down the road, the one with the red gate, if it was still red. He told me he'd wanted to write, eventually. Stories, poetry, anything that let him put a feeling into words instead of just carrying it around inside him. He'd lived here alone, same as me. His family had been 2 provinces away, and he hadn't minded the distance back then. Bangkok had felt enormous, and his. And then, he said, he'd met someone. I felt my chest tighten hearing that. I told myself it was just the pull of a sad story, the natural ache you feel listening to someone describe love they've lost. But some smaller, quieter part of me already knew this wasn't going to feel like just any story. Who was he? I asked. His eyes lifted to mine, and for a moment, something flickered there, hope and grief tangled so tightly together I couldn't tell which one was winning. He said he didn't know how to answer that yet. Not without telling me everything first. So he did. He told me they'd met in the rain, something so ordinary, he said, that he almost laughed telling it. He'd been running for the covered market, trying to keep his books dry, and he'd run straight into someone. Books everywhere. Both of them soaked, laughing before they'd even said a single word to each other. The stranger had helped him gather everything, unhurried, even though the rain hadn't let up at all. Peach said that was the moment he understood something about him, that here was someone who didn't mind being inconvenienced by kindness. That mattered more to him than he could explain. They'd started finding reasons to run into each other after that, he told me. Not by accident anymore, though they'd both pretended it still was, for a while. Coffee that turned into hours. Walks that turned into entire evenings neither of them could account for afterward. He said the man wasn't loud. Wasn't someone who filled a room the moment he walked into it. But when he looked at you, really looked, Peach said you felt like the only steady thing in a world that otherwise wouldn't stop spinning. He told me he'd loved him before he even let himself admit what the feeling was called. What happened to him? I asked, gently, even though some part of me was already afraid of the answer. He didn't respond right away. His grip on my hand tightened, not painfully, just enough that I understood this next part was going to cost him something to say. There was a night, he told me. The last night before everything changed. They were supposed to leave the city together. The man had family trouble somewhere far from Bangkok, something urgent he needed to go handle. He'd promised it would only be a few weeks. He'd promised he'd come back for Peach, and that when he did, they'd finally stop hiding what they were to each other, finally just be together, without looking over their shoulders. Peach said he believed him completely. Not because he was naive, he told me, but because the men had never once given him a reason not to. He left that night. Peach said he remembered standing at the window, watching the street until he couldn't see him anymore. A few weeks passed. Then a month. Then, he told me, he stopped counting, because counting made the waiting feel too much like a countdown to something he didn't want to name. He never found out what happened to him. Whether he'd forgotten Peach, or something had happened to him, or the life he'd gone back to had simply swallowed him whole and he'd decided this one, the one with Peach in it, wasn't worth returning to. All he knew, he said, was that he kept waiting. Every night. In this apartment. Long after it stopped making sense to. And at some point, he told me, he'd stopped being able to leave. I didn't say anything for a long moment. What was there to say? I'd asked for the truth, and he'd given it to me, raw and unfinished in all the places grief doesn't let itself be tidy. You died waiting for him, I finally said. Not a question. I already knew. He nodded slowly, tears sliding freely down his face now, no longer hidden, no longer restrained. He told me he died believing his lover was still coming. That was the part that never stopped hurting, he said. Not the dying. The believing. I pulled him closer without thinking about it, this cold, grieving, decades-old ache of a person, folding into me like he'd been waiting for permission to stop holding himself together alone. I'm sorry, I whispered, because it was the only true thing I had. I'm so sorry that happened to you. He didn't answer in words. He just let himself be held, for the first time in longer than either of us could probably measure, while the lamp flickered steady beside us, and outside, the city carried on completely unaware that something impossibly old and impossibly sad was finally, quietly, beginning to heal. I want to be honest about something, even if it embarrasses me a little to admit it now. Somewhere between the tears and the silence and the story he'd just given me, pieces of himself he clearly hadn't spoken aloud in decades, I stopped seeing him as strange, or frightening, or even purely as something to pity. I just saw him. The way the lamp light caught the side of his face when he looked down. The way his damp hair fell messily over his forehead no matter how many times he pushed it back. The unfair, almost unreal beauty of him, pale skin, dark eyes, that soft mouth that trembled every time he tried to hold back what he was feeling. He was devastating to look at, and somehow more devastating for how little he seemed to know it. I remember thinking, absurdly, he's beautiful even like this. Especially like this. It should have scared me more than it did, falling for someone who technically shouldn't exist, who was cold to the touch, who belonged to a story that ended long before I was ever born. But sitting there with his hand still in mine, I didn't feel fear anymore. I felt something closer to wanting. Careful, quiet, entirely unexpected wanting. And underneath that, something else, something I wasn't ready to look at directly yet. Not just attraction. Recognition. I didn't sleep at all that night. Not because I was afraid anymore, I don't think I'd been afraid of him in a long time, but because my mind wouldn't stop turning over everything he'd told me, looking for a shape I couldn't quite see yet. A promise. A departure. A love that never came back. And underneath all of it, quiet and insistent, a question I wasn't ready to ask out loud yet. Why did hearing his story feel less like listening, and more like remembering? I went back to the letters the next day. I hadn't been able to bring myself to read them before, it had felt like trespassing into something too private, too sacred, while Peach was still watching. But now that he'd told me his story, I felt like I finally had permission. I sat on the floor of that apartment in the late afternoon light and untied the brittle string with careful hands, the paper inside so fragile I was afraid it might crumble if I breathed on it wrong. The handwriting was elegant, slightly slanted, clearly written in a hurry more than once. Love letters, the way people used to write them before everything became a text message you could send in 3 seconds and regret forever. I read them slowly, one by one, each one dated a few days apart, each one more urgent than the last. I think about you every hour I'm away. I'll come back before the rain ends, I promise you that. Whatever happens, don't stop waiting for me. I mean that with everything in me. They weren't signed with a full name. Just a single initial. My stomach dropped so quickly I thought I might be sick. I told myself it was a coincidence. Bangkok is full of names that start with K. My own name doesn't mean I'm the only person on earth carrying it. But then I found the photograph again, the one from the drawer, the one I'd barely let myself look at properly before. Peach, laughing, sunlight in his hair. And beside him, cut off at the shoulder in the old, damaged print, just enough of another person to make out dark hair, a familiar tilt of the head. I couldn't see the face. The photo was torn there, deliberately, or from decades of handling, I couldn't tell which. I sat with that photograph for a long time, my heart doing something strange and heavy in my chest, refusing to let me pretend I didn't understand what I was looking at. That night, I found Peach sitting in the chair by the window, the one he always seemed drawn to, staring out at the same street he must have watched 1,000 times before. I sat across from him and asked the question I'd been circling for days. "The man who promised to come back for you," I said. "What was his name?" He went very still. "Why does it matter now?" he asked quietly. "Because I think I might already know it," I said. "And I need you to tell me if I'm wrong." He looked at me for a long moment, something breaking slowly across his features. "Kian," he finally said. His name was Kian. The letters in my hand suddenly felt heavier than paper should. Kian. Kim. I understood, then, everything I hadn't been able to explain since that very first night, the pull I'd felt toward him, the dreams of streets that didn't exist anymore, of a rain-soaked market, of a face I couldn't quite see clearly enough to recognize. "I think I'm him," I whispered. "I think, somehow, I'm Kian." He didn't answer right away. Tears slid silently down his face. "I wondered," he finally said, voice trembling. "The moment you walked into this room, that first night, I wondered. But I was afraid to let myself believe it. I stopped letting myself hope a long time ago. It hurt too much to be wrong." I reached for his hand. "I don't remember any of it," I admitted. "Not really. Just fragments. But I know that everything in me has been pulling toward you since the first night, and I don't think that's a coincidence anymore." There was still something I needed to understand. "If I'm him," I said. "Then what happened? Why didn't I ever come back?" He was quiet for a long time before he answered. "How did you die?" I finally asked. He was silent for a long moment. Then he
How did you
smiled,
die?
sadly. "I was waiting for someone." "That doesn't answer my question," I said gently. He looked toward the apartment door. "After he didn't come home." I told myself one more day. Then another. Then another. He told me the rest slowly, like each detail cost him something to hand over. He'd sit by that window every evening, watching for a shadow in the hallway, listening for footsteps that were never quite the right rhythm. The rain gave way to summer. Summer gave way to autumn. Autumn turned cold, and still he waited, growing thinner, weaker, though he barely seemed to notice it happening to him. One night, "I was burning with fever," he said quietly. "A neighbor knocked on my door. 'Peach, open the door, you need a doctor.' I could barely stand. I rested my forehead against the door, and I whispered, 'If I leave, and he comes back, he'll think I broke my promise.' She left, eventually. She thought I'd let her take me tomorrow. Tomorrow never came. The apartment went silent after that. Days passed before the landlord finally unlocked the door. Peach was gone. I didn't say anything for a long moment. What was there to say? He hadn't died because something violent or random had taken him. He died because he'd loved someone so completely that keeping a promise had mattered more to him than saving his own life. It wasn't the tragedy of abandonment I'd assumed at the start of all this. It was the tragedy of loyalty taken all the way to its very end. It took me 3 more days of digging, old hospital records, a small mention in an even older newspaper archive I'd almost given up finding. What I discovered was this. Kian had left the city that night exactly as he'd promised, called away by a family emergency 2 provinces over. He'd intended to return within weeks, just as he'd told Peach. But there had been an accident on the road back. A bus, a rain-slicked highway, a driver who never should have been driving that night. Kian never made it back to Bangkok. He never made it back to Peach. He never even had the chance to break the promise on purpose. It had been broken for him, cruelly, by circumstance, by timing, by a world that didn't care how much two people loved each other. He had died the same year Peach did, just a few months apart, each of them believing something different about why the other one never came. I sat with that discovery for a long time, grief and relief tangled together in a way I didn't fully have words for. Peach had spent decades believing he'd been abandoned. But he hadn't been. He'd simply never gotten to know the truth. I went back to the apartment that night with only one thing left I needed to do. I needed to finally tell him. That night and told him everything. Kian's name. The accident on the rain-slicked road. The promise that had never been broken on purpose, only stolen, cruelly, by timing neither of them could have controlled. I watched something shift in him as I spoke. Not just grief anymore. Relief. 20 years of believing he'd been left behind, and now, finally, the truth, he never had been. He'd simply never gotten the chance to know it. You didn't fail him, I told him. And he didn't fail you. You both just ran out of time. He cried then, harder than I'd ever seen him cry, not the quiet, restrained tears from before, but something that looked like it had been waiting years for permission to finally break loose completely. I held him that night. But I want to be clear about something, the truth didn't fix everything right away. Grief that old doesn't dissolve in a single conversation, no matter how much closure it brings. What changed after that night wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. The nights that followed were different. He still appeared every midnight, the way he always had. But the fear I used to carry into those moments, even the last traces of it, was completely gone. I found myself looking forward to it instead. Counting down the hours until the apartment went quiet enough for him to appear. We talked more, now that talking didn't cost him so much. Small things, at first. He told me about books he'd loved before he died, poems he'd wanted to write but never finished. I told him about Korea, about my family, about the architecture I wanted to build one day, buildings meant to last, I told him, only half joking, unlike the one we were sitting in. He laughed at that. A real laugh, easy and unguarded, nothing like the fragile almost smile from those first nights. I remember thinking, the first time I heard it, that I would have given up a great deal to hear it again. Slowly, without either of us naming it out loud, something shifted between the two of us. It wasn't sudden. It was small moments, stacked one on top of another until they became impossible to ignore. The way he started sitting closer instead of keeping his careful distance. The way I stopped just tolerating the cold of his hand and started reaching for it first, before he even offered it. The way we'd talk long after midnight had passed, neither of us willing to be the one who let the conversation end. I remember the night I realized I wasn't just falling for the story of him anymore, the tragedy, the mystery, the ghost who'd waited 20 years. I was falling for him. The way he tilted his head slightly when he was genuinely curious about something. The dry, quiet humor he'd clearly kept hidden from the world even when he was alive. The way his eyes softened, every single time, when he looked at me like I was something worth being careful with, the exact words he'd once used to describe being loved by Kian. I asked him, one night, if it scared him. Falling for someone all over again, after everything waiting had cost him the first time. He considered the question seriously before answering. Everything about loving someone is a risk, he said. I learned that the hard way. But I'd rather risk it again than spend one more year being too afraid to feel anything at all. I started noticing changes in him too, small things, at first, that I almost convinced myself I'd imagined. His hand felt less cold against mine some nights. His eyes, which had always carried that distant, waiting quality, started looking simply present instead, focused entirely on whoever, whatever, was directly in front of him. Me. He smiled more. Not the sad, fragile almost smile from before. Something fuller. Something that reached all the way to his eyes. One night, sitting close together by the window, he admitted it himself. I don't feel like I'm waiting anymore, he said quietly. For the first time in longer than I can remember, I just feel like I'm here. With you. I reached over and brushed the damp hair back from his forehead, the way I'd wanted to do for weeks without quite admitting it to myself. I love you, I told him. Simple, unplanned, the truest thing I'd said in longer than I could remember either. He went very still, the way he always did right before something important. Then, slowly, that same soft smile spread across his face, except this time, it wasn't sad at all. I love you too, he said. I think some part of me has loved you since the very first night you walked through that door. I noticed the real change the morning after that. He felt warmer. Not cold, the way he'd always been. Warmer, steadier, more present, like something that had been holding him together by sheer stubborn grief was finally, gently, allowed to let go. I think I'm ready, he told me one dawn, voice soft but sure. I don't think I'm supposed to still be here. My chest ached hearing it, even though some part of me had known this moment was coming from the second I understood the truth of who we were to each other. I don't want you to go, I admitted. You're not losing me, he said gently. You're finally letting me rest. And I got to fall in love again before I did. I got to be loved, fully, without fear. That's more than I ever thought I'd get to have. He asked me to stay with him until the sun came up. I did. As the light started to change outside the window, he grew lighter somehow, not fading exactly, not the way ghosts disappear in stories. It was gentler than that. Like watching someone finally exhale after holding their breath for 20 years. Thank you, he whispered, for coming back. And for loving me the way you did, even after everything. I'll always come back, I told him. Even if I don't remember, some part of me will always come back to you. He reached up and touched my face, real warmth in his hand now, instead of cold, and by the time the sun had fully risen, the space beside me was simply, quietly, empty. Not cold this time. Just still. And peaceful. Apartment 404 felt different after that. Lighter. Like a held breath finally released. I stayed there for the rest of the semester. I never saw him again. But I never felt that I'd lost him, either. It felt more like he'd finally been allowed to go somewhere he'd earned a long time ago, and I'd simply been the one lucky enough to love him there. Months later, I was walking through a market near campus, the same kind of covered market Peach had once described to me, the one where he'd first met Kian in the rain. A young man bumped into me, apologizing quickly, scrambling to catch the books that had slipped from his arms. I bent down to help him gather them, and when he looked up to thank me, something in my chest went completely still. Same face. Same soft, startled smile. No recognition in his eyes at all, just the easy, unguarded warmth of a stranger meeting another stranger for the first time. Sorry about that, he said, laughing a little, embarrassed. It's fine, I said, smiling back before I could stop myself.
Thank you
I'm
so
Kian.
much, that's very kind of you.
He smiled wider. I'm Peach.
No worries at all, glad to help.
That's where apartment 404 ends. Not with a haunting. Not really with a tragedy, either, not in the end. Just two people who loved each other enough to survive missing each other for 20 years, and a promise that finally, quietly, got kept. If this story meant something to you, make sure you're subscribed here on Nightfall Studio. There are more stories like this one coming, and I don't want you to miss the next one. Thank you for staying until the end. I'll see you in the next story.